Hey there, folks. Zane from the Infinite Jukebox, aka the #1 Kraftwerk fan, here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Ben Frost record, Scope Neglect. Ben Frost has a highly dedicated fan base, and just like a number of other often deeply experimental electronic musicians out there who are still active today, there are tons of people who know his discography from front to back, through and through, but I think it's not too terribly crazy to say that discussion around him and his place as the center of topics and the center of talk surrounding a lot of notable electronic musicians at least partly peaked back in 2014 with his rightfully beloved album Aurora, and since then he's continued doing his own thing just as he did before that record. But seeing as so much of his most beloved work stems from noise-based pieces, ambient-based pieces, a lot of people seem to forget or at least generally ignore the more guitar-oriented side of his artistic capabilities or the side of his sound that is, generally speaking, less inherently electronic, the kind of side of his artistic identity that sees him making electronic music out of non-traditionally electronic sounds. It's kind of something that he's always done in one way or another. It's just that I feel a lot of people don't really look into it that much. There are a lot of times throughout Ben Frost's best work where he's just doing something that doesn't feel at all traditional, and because of that, he's an absolutely amazing composer. I mean, even some of his more traditional drone albums do not feel like traditional drone whatsoever as they venture into a variety of different creative corners, going down a variety of artistic avenues that most other drone composers probably would not have the guts to go down. And because of that, I again feel like a lot of people don't really acknowledge the fact that Ben Frost is doing this constantly because, well, he is doing it constantly, and it becomes such a unique part of his creative identity that some people tend to overlook it and underappreciate just how daring he can be as a composer at times. And I really don't think that anything he's done since 2014 is that much lesser than the kind of material he was putting out on records like Aurora, on records like Steel Wound. It's just that he's been consistently experimenting since then. I digress. Back to the more traditional oriented kind of sounds that he often rejects. I do feel that he does often refuse to embrace some of the more metal adjacent tendencies that he has demonstrated on a few records in the past, opting out to go in a more power noise or straight noise direction, or more generally speaking, more commonly embracing more subtle examples of electronic music, not really just straight up going in the direction of putting metal into the context of ambient and electronic music. And I feel like, again, a lot of people don't take note of the fact that he has experimented with metal-based sounds in the past, despite the fact that he has on several records, just because of the fact that, like I said, he never really fully embraced it throughout a full-length LP, and I think that Scope Neglect is the album trying to change that. Scope Neglect acts as a means to change many individuals' perception of Frost's artistic identity and abilities, while at the same time succeeding in being a fairly interesting experiment from him, despite having enough flaws to make me not really want to call it one of his better works. Much of Scope Neglect is composed extremely well, and that honestly feels a bit stupid for me to point out, considering I'm talking about such a veteran of experimental music, of sound art, of electronic music. Of course, this is a well-composed record, but I do feel that it is still worth pointing out that even on a fairly unique, in the context of his discography, experiment like Scope Neglect, Ben Frost is still putting in as much effort as possible to put out as detailed of an album as he wants to be putting out, and I feel like on this record right here, he does put out a fairly detailed album. Scope Neglect as a record was obviously made with a deep amount of passion and love for the idea of pivoting into a creative direction that goes well beyond the basic concepts of industrial music, just like many prior Frost albums have. And I think there are a number of distinct moments here that really do highlight how painstakingly detailed some of the best moments in Ben Frost's discography can be. I mean, I can sit here all day and talk about previous albums from him and specific moments from those records that really stick with me after listening to them multiple times, but this record in particular, again after listening to it multiple times, still has its own fair share of pretty memorable passages. The midpoint of the track, the river of light and radiation, sees this sort of sludgy industrial metal riff influence being picked up, while at the same time the significantly more dialed back synths are made to kind of have this background presence that only add another layer to the song without ever feeling like they don't have any purpose. And I feel like that track and that moment in that track in particular really emphasizes just how much Frost is leaning into certain sounds that we don't often see from him, despite them popping up a few times here or there. I feel like that song in particular, as a piece, as a composition, really does highlight a lot of the creative intent going on here, honestly. I think that Scope Neglect is a record meant to highlight a very specific niche within the context of his creative abilities, and I think that song really does emphasize those. Elsewhere, you have the track Tritium Bath, which has a lot of intentionally oddly placed bits of percussion towards the back half and midpoint of the track, which give it this very off-kilter kind of feel, which I can understand why it would be off-putting for some individuals, absolutely, but I personally feel that it greatly benefits that song in particular, especially seeing as it's the penultimate track of the entire project. I think that ultimately the way that the percussion is added to that song gives it this very awkward feel, but in the best way. Like, it doesn't necessarily belong there, and it feels especially jagged, but because of that, it brings its own unique form of build-up. Not really building up in terms of pure atmosphere. It's not like there's some giant explosion going on here in terms of sound or style, but rather a build-up in the form of so much oddity being thrown at the listener after a record of otherwise pretty stable and mostly synth-based oddities. I feel like utilizing the percussion as a means to sort of throw the listener off is something that's definitely unique, and it succeeds pretty well in that moment. And at the end of the day, it's small moments like those that add up to the bigger picture of Scope Neglect as a whole, and you could say that not only about other Ben Frost records, but just about a ton of other records out there, especially within the realm of industrial and post-industrial, two genres that are almost totally reliant on finding their own distinct ways to be unique, finding some interesting, different way from all of their peers and contemporaries to present various experimental and sound art based ideas. And while I do think that the relatively brief runtime of under 40 minutes that Frost presents here may initially seem a touch underwhelming, especially for people who want just maybe a bit more meat on their album, especially an atmosphere focused album like this, I do think that the majority of the time that is spent here is spent pretty well and is utilized for the greater good of the record. Now, something that is surely to be a major point of contention in the discussion of this record in the coming weeks, coming months, hell, probably coming years, is the fact that this record, Scope Neglect, feels noticeably less textured than anything else, or at least most other projects that Ben Frost has put out up to this point. And I don't necessarily think that's a horrible thing, but I do think this does make the album stand out at times in a way that I wouldn't consider particularly positive either. Now, I would like to clarify, I am almost 100% certain that this is completely intentional as an artistic decision, and I don't think that means that there is a lesser amount of effort being put in here than, say, on another album by him. I just mean to say that the various synths, drums, and other instruments being brought to the table here are made to sound fairly raw in nature, and that's not necessarily something you can say about a ton of his other projects, especially some of his most notable projects, which generally speaking tend to feel significantly more chaotic than Scope Neglect, and I can definitely see why someone would not be able to click with this album after clicking with some other records from him. And in this way, I would almost say that Scope Neglect feels maybe a bit more notable within the context of the Ben Frost discography, his overall artistic body of work, than it does on its own as just an individualistic record. I feel like you might be able to appreciate this one a little bit more if you have the context of his prior music before you check out this record on its own. I mean, this is a masterful composer, experimentalist, electronic musician, largely stripping back the qualities of what made certain other records of his so appealing to various different audiences within the realm of electronic music, and making some of the most DIY sounding material that he's put out in quite some time. Arguably, some of the most DIY sounding material that he's put out to date, fairly far into his career as a performer. And from the perspective of this in his discography, in his artistic evolution, I think that this is a deeply interesting record that's very fun to dive into and discuss in comparison to other albums that he's put out over time. But at the same time, I can completely understand, again, why maybe someone would find this a bit too minimalistic, a bit too underwhelming, a bit too reliant on the negative space of the audio in many different places, especially on the first half of the record. But as a whole, I do think if you have the context of Ben Frost behind yourself as you go into this record, there's a lot to find interesting here, even if you don't really find yourself revisiting it a ton. I mean, Scope Neglect does not feature the ominous classical leanings of By the Throw. It refuses to lean into the more power electronics and total noise-oriented sounds that can be found sprinkled at various points in his discography, and it doesn't even really embrace any of the totally dark ambient sounds that he's been primarily working with over the course of the past few years as he's soundtracked various TV shows and other pieces of media. This album is, again, for better or for worse, some of the most stripped-back DIY stuff that we've gotten from him in quite a long time, and that it definitely will not be appealing to some people, I will admit. And I will also admit that in some ways, Scope Neglect does kind of leave the listener wanting in some regards. I mean, I'm all about minimalism within music, but there are some points in this record where I do feel like maybe things could have been a little bit more fleshed out, a little more lush in nature. I mean, you have the album closing track Unreal in the Eyes of the Dead, where it doesn't really feel like a proper conclusion to the record. It doesn't really have any moment that feels especially final, and while there is an argument to be made that that is entirely intentional to kind of give off the spacey, ominous qualities of the record in its final moments, I also think it's a pretty unsatisfying ending to the record overall, and that's not to mention the fact that some of the more industrial and guitar-based influences on tracks like Chimera don't really feel like they have anything being built upon them beyond the most base form of their sound, and by that I mean that the tones that are found there don't really feel like they work with anything beyond what you would expect to find within very straightforward meat and potatoes industrial metal with some sludge influences. And while it does sound solid for a fairly brief album like this, it definitely makes it a bit more difficult to revisit without becoming a little bit more critical of it with each passing listen. This is an album that will likely fail to appeal to some, if not even just a pretty solid chunk of Ben Frost's fan base up to this point. And if I'm being completely frank, I think if you are a new listener to Ben Frost, if you are trying to get into him, listen to literally any other album this man has put out. This is a horrible place to start with this music from really anyone, but especially someone like Ben Frost. Listen, I'm just saying, you got Aurora, you got Theory of Machines, you got The Center Cannot Hold, you've got plenty of records that are just as accessible as this, which is somewhat, while at the same time feeling much more representative of his sound, of his style, of his willingness to experiment at various points in the same record. But with that being said, if you do already feel like you appreciate the man's music, or you just appreciate a more minimalistic approach to industrial metal, a more minimalistic approach to metal being combined with ambient music, then, I mean, yeah, I would say give this one a go. And that's because through it all, Scope Neglect, above all else, feels like a pretty interesting peek into the creative mind of Ben Frost and some of the most intriguingly crude corners of his creative ability, and I don't mean that in a negative way either. This is a raw album, undeniably, and I enjoy it for the most part because of that, even if I do have my own personal qualms with it, and some may find it a touch amateurish in comparison to some of his other projects, and, I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't totally disagree. With that being said, despite its sometimes glaring flaw of feeling just a touch undercooked, underbaked, if you will, in a few different segments, I do think that Scope Neglect is a record worth diving into if you are interested in Frost's discography and if you are interested in this sort of odd experimentalism between various different genres and subgenres, just as long as you aren't taking this as a representation of his sound as a whole, because besides the fact I don't think one album really does represent him, it certainly would not be this one if I had to choose one. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.